We're doing
So
September, right?
this is September. This is the Leaders Lab for September, and the theme is welcome. I first wanted to do a few announcements, just like church. First is that April Rosario, our Director of Young Youth Resources, wrote the packet because I was involved in other things, and man, does she have some yummy ideas in this packet. Also, we're going to stay a bit today and push a different record button to do some Article 2 brainstorming at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. The next one of these, the RE Leader Labs, is September 13th at 1 p.m. That would be on the theme of heritage. And we already have up and posted on our Soul Matters RE YouTube channel the small RE program adaptations recording, which I did last month. And if you want to know the specifics about how we're doing small RE adaptations for the packet, that would be a good one to watch. It's only 12 to 15 minutes. So welcome, the theme of welcome. And here we go. There's 4 sessions. The many sources of nourishment, which is our water communion session. The work of a wider welcome. Welcoming change, which autumnal equinox gets in there, as well as the Article 2 stuff, which I'll talk about in a second. And the last one for the month of September, for the theme of welcoming, is welcoming in the work of apology and forgiveness, which is our nod to the fact that it'll be Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur for our Jewish cousins. So the overarching frame of these packets this year is the gifts of our faith. We're wondering how we give and receive the gifts of these 10 values that we're going through this year. So that will be one of the lines, the threads that goes through every packet. The other piece is the Article 2 insertions. About 20% of the folks that did our survey last spring said they didn't want to do any Article 2 information. So what we did was put all of our Article 2 connections in a blue box within the curriculum, so that if we can help your congregation discern how it feels about these values and inspirations and the big change, you're welcome to use that blue box to say, oh, da, 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 and we have some suggested scripts in there. If you don't want to, you just skip the blue box. And it's still a rich and engaging set of themes. Da, da, da. So the thing that we heard so strongly from everyone was, first, RE programs have shrunk. And I addressed that in last month's Zoom about the adaptations for small group programs. The other thing is that RE staff have been given more work. They see increasing responsibilities. And so what we've done is 2 things to help our DREs use these packets. The first is to offer more leader notes. The second is to offer more focused curation. That's so these packets can be handed directly to volunteers if it's appropriate for you to do that. And I always think of the Hewlett-Packard executive who's sitting on my shoulder, who worked for us as a volunteer in RE many years, but the first time I asked him to go into the kindergarten class in Sunday school, he said, Katie, the idea of presenting to 150 execs about my new software is fine. The idea of sitting down with 12 kindergartners is giving me the willies. So would you help me get used to this? So I always think of him sitting on my shoulder when I write these leader introductions and curate the ideas that we put in. So here we go into the actual session. The first part is the introduce it, and you'll notice that we've changed the Wonder Box session into a gift box session. And that's because that overarching frame is about the gifts of our faith. And children know what comes in presents, gifts. And they know at a birthday party, they both give gifts, but if it's their birthday, they receive gifts. So we're using the gifts of our faith as a Wonder Box. It's almost like a substitution. And of course, as you know, you can always keep it as a Wonder Box if you like that. The theme of welcome is what we're looking at for how we widen the circle for others, but also how you are welcomed as you are. So in the September packet, which April wrote, July, I think is when she wrote that, we didn't yet have the idea, but this is the idea I want to share with you. We're going to use hymn 402 from You I Receive as the chalice lighting for these themes. So I want to just lift that up. It's now been put in the chalice lighting Google Doc that we are curating to put. There must be 20 different chalice lightings now in there that you and your teachers can use. Then we have a tellable tale for the story, as well as a picture book. And there's some leader resources on how you use oral storytelling for a tellable tale. These are wisdom stories, so they can be either for all ages, or they can be something that the teacher likes to just explain to the children. And then there's always a picture book. And some of them are suggested by our Widening the Circle research team, which was overflowing with ideas for the last 2 years. And so this year we're not grabbing new ones, we're using the overflowing ideas that they have provided us with. Then we have things that are called the Explore It section. These are multiple intelligent ways of getting at the theme. You've already gotten it at it through a chalice lighting, you've gotten at it through a story or a picture book. So now we say, okay, what other ways are you going to use the lens of this particular first session, which is the water communion, in different ways? Well, there are all kinds of ideas for water play relays, and there's some special watermelon juice drinks made out of water and watermelon juice and lime in there. And those are the things that we do as ways to, ways that the children can explore the session more deeply and with multiple intelligences. Session B, which is the work of a wider welcome. This is where we talk about the challenges and the comforts of extending a wider welcome. I wanted to lift up especially the welcome challenge, because I would love to be a fly on the wall when this starts happening in the classroom. The welcome challenge is a circle of chairs and one empty chair, almost like Elijah at the Passover meal. How would you welcome, you say to the children, a child who has just moved into the neighborhood and has come to your church and to your classroom? How would you welcome a non-English speaking child? I have a little tangential story about how often this is happening in my life, and I suspect in our congregation's lives. I was at the playground with 2 of my grandchildren, and there was a woman not speaking English there. It turned out I went over to the horror of my grandchildren who are very shy. I went over to talk to her and say hello. Turned out she spoke very fluent English, and she was from the Ukraine. She had just come over 3 months ago, and her husband was still there, and they had to leave her elderly mother in the Ukraine as well. Her children did not speak English very well, and they were in my grandchildren's class. So we talked to each other and introduced each other. And then my grandchildren, and I would propose all of our children, were inspired to look up on his Google Translate app on his smartphone how you say hello in Ukraine. And then my younger granddaughter said, I guess I will find out how I invite this little boy to join some of our games. So what would our children in RE do if they had a non-English speaking child walk into their Sunday school classroom? And how would they be welcoming? These things might happen, and what a nice thing to think about it in advance. What about a visually impaired child? What would they do? What about someone who's never been to a UU congregation before? Here's my little tangential information here. Tandeka offered a weekend on Beloved Community for the local ministers and DREs. Oh, gee, might have been 7 years ago. But what she asked us to do was to pretend that this family had just walked into RE and we jumped all over them. And the role plays were hilarious and very embarrassing because, of course, what everyone said is, oh, we have this great sexuality class and you want to come and we're going to talk about masturbation, right to this family who walks into the UU congregation the very first time. And unfortunately, people were just thinking, oh my gosh, I might have done this, you know, somebody who just walked in. So just like Owl, we want to prepare in advance to think through these things and also maybe be a little quieter to the new child who walks in, not jump on them with sexuality. Oh yeah, and of course the other thing that we did in that role play with Tandeka was, oh, and don't you want to be a Sunday school teacher? That's the best way to learn about our faith. You know, I almost was guilty of that once. So anyway, what about a child who walks in and is in a wheelchair? Or what about a child who walks in and misses a parent? These are all things that we're asking in this welcome challenge activity for the children to think about who's going to sit in that empty chair. And it really helps us widen our welcome and also understand the challenges of having children who come in with different ways of being in the world. The second part of this session B is something I actually did in the congregation I served right before I ended up retiring, and that is welcome bags for the visitor table. So we needed to have a simple crafts project. And I thought about, well, wouldn't it be nice to give a welcome bag? And were just little brown paper lunch bags to the children and their families as they walk in the door. And they go to the visitors table, and instead of just getting a name tag, they're given a welcome bag. And in that welcome bag were things like a card that said welcome, a brochure about the church, a brochure about UU, a Dove chocolate heart, something that was sweet, links to our Facebook page and to a UU video in general about what is Unitarian Universalism, some pipe cleaners, so if the children decided to go into the sanctuary with their parents, they had a little something to do, and an invitation to an upcoming event. This was what I learned from two people. One was a startup UU congregation, the other was the mega church down the street that had 30,000 people in it. Both those congregations invited their people in. Within a week of walking in, they'd say, would you like to come to this book study? Or this, in the big church, it was a Bible study group, or this parents of teens group. Within a week, they invited them to a smaller group. So that was what was in the welcome bag. And of course, then we decorated the lunch bags, and it was just really nice. And we also made bridges to those people who were at the welcome table, who very rarely in that congregation came down the RE Hall. In lesson C of 4, we have the story, the wisdom story, the stream and the desert, which I love and is a wonderful way to illustrate change. The desert says, you may have to change to get across me. It's a Sufi story. And then we look at change through the lens of the autumnal equinox. That's the change in seasons. And that gives us an opportunity to go into this Article 2 conversation, which is that UU is a faith of change. Jenny probably has heard this anecdote before, but I'll share it with everybody in our listening audience that when I met my now husband, Mark, he was very active in the Presbyterian Church. And when I described UU, he had never heard of it. When I described UU, he as a faith that changes, it's a living tradition. He was floored. He says, wait, this is just totally out of my paradigm, because our Nicene Creed has not changed since what? 30 BC or 300 BC, or no, 300 AD. And you're saying you changed and you had these principles way back in the 1800s, and then they changed. And in 86, you have some, and of course now he's floored again because we're in the Article 2 conversation about a whole new set of values. But I am very pleased and proud that our faith takes change as one of the very important pieces of our faith. And so you can talk to the children about that. So Soul Matters isn't going to help you decide, but we will help support you as you introduce this to the children and families, and as you try to discern yourself what you feel about the Article 2 changes, which we're going to talk about in the next hour. All right, so session D, that's the 4th one, is the nod to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It's about forgiveness and apology. Here's my frustration with our faith. My whole career, since 1983, I learned that Catholics have a ceremony of confession, which many of them are now calling the ceremony of reconciliation. What a beautiful concept. Reconciling with God, reconciling your soul, instead of just confessing your sins. But that's how they deal with forgiveness and apology. The Jews, of course, right at that time of year, the end of September, have Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, this beautiful Day of Atonement, where you once again say you're sorry to people who you might have offended over the year. And what do we have? What are our rituals of forgiveness and apology? Well, we don't have one, do we? And we still don't. I mean, we're learning how to make some apologies, but we are conflict adverse as a faith because of our wonderful characteristic of being idealists. So when something bad happens, we really don't know how to deal with it. It comes from our Christian background that if we were in heaven and everything was perfect, there would be angels and harps and all that sort of stuff. As opposed to Buddhism, where in Buddhism they say nirvana isn't perfect, but you deal with conflict in the best way possible. So they recognize that there's going to be conflict, but in nirvana, it's a different thing than having to be perfect. Anyway, that's my spiel about forgiveness and apology in our faith. Someday I would love to do it. I wrote a curriculum at one point that was about the kids developing their own ceremony of forgiveness and mistakes. But the takeaway for this session, it's not this in this packet. Unfortunately, the takeaway for this session is that as we talk about Article 2, tensions will arise. And I love that that's the approach. And how do we make apologies when we make mistakes? Because it's not if we make mistakes, it's when we make mistakes. It's the same thing for racial justice, isn't it? How do we make forgiveness and apology? April has put in this wonderful science project that illustrates forgiveness and apology. It's the magic pepper. You drop in water, some dish soap, some pepper first, and then the dish soap from your finger, just a drop in there, and it shoots the surface tension, shoots the pepper to the side of the plate. It's very sudden and really dramatic. It's a good way to say when you make an apology, the air clears and you feel good again and you have a clear relationship. I love using science when we do this with kids. Then there's an example in the same session of the way we deal with mindfulness moments. It's a walking meditation, and you're inviting the children to walk and imagine this fog, imagine their legs getting heavy, imagine that they are met by a friend who sits on a bench with them, and then the fog lifts and they get an understanding of how important it is to say you're sorry, and then they can skip and feel lighter. There's an apology hot potato activity, which is the same fun idea of throw the hot potato around or whatever you have, and when the music stops, you say something that you associate with forgiveness or apology, something you might like to say. In the end of this packet are all the books in order of session, so that you and your staff can pull them out for all ages if you'd like to, or you can just hand them to a minister who might like to know which stories are going to be in which session. And then finally, there's the soul work table section, where we pull out from every session the things that might work for that table in the back or front of the sanctuary. And in this one, April's put in water play, and that's because her congregation sounds like it's so rowdy, and they really could do water play in the sanctuary. Some of us may not want to have quite such a rowdy thing in there. There's the suggestion of doing the welcome bag decorating right at the table. There's a activity of doing the friendship bracelets at the soul work table and leaf rubbing. So you use your discernment to pick the building blocks that you would use in your congregation in the front or back of the sanctuary on a soul work table. So that is my overview of the packet. And now what I invite us to do is talk about the theme for September of welcome, challenges that you're facing, suggestions, then we'll talk about opportunities, and then we'll do takeaways before we start that Article 2 recording that's going to come at the end of this session. Anybody have challenges first of what you're doing in September to open up your program?
I'd like to discuss this idea that, when I first entered the work, we might have 2 or 3 grade levels in a particular room. Right now, what I'm looking at is the nursery through kindergarten, 1st through 5th, and 6th through 12th.
Mhm.
For me, they're not idealistic, but this is what I'm working with our current numbers and our resources in regards to teachers and how hard it is to recruit teachers at this time.
Mhm.
With that said, I am thinking about developing centers based off the packets so that we would engage in the opening circle. We would talk about the story and then maybe do 1 or 2 small activities together. It depends on how well we can, keep the children's attention and, of course, their age range.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's what I'm thinking about, is having like different, maybe 3 to 5 centers. Um, I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
Cool. All right, and before I jump in, Jenny, what are you thinking about? And we can round robin all these thoughts.
We had a gap. We didn't really have, we had 3-year-olds and 5-year-olds, rising 2 to 3-year-olds last year. They ended up the year at 3. And then we had kindergartners. We didn't have any really 4 or 5-year-olds. And so this year, now, we don't really have any 5-year-olds still. So they're moving on. But now we've got 4-year-olds, like 2.
Mhm.
So they're too old to be in the nursery, because we also have a couple infants now that we didn't have before, and small toddlers, 1.5 years. So I'm not, that is a challenge that I am facing, that is different than anything I had to do last year. So it's new.
Nice.
So that's a challenge I have. Corinna, I was thinking about when you said that, we had in my previous congregation, a fellowship hall was our space mostly. We had 2 classrooms, but when I first started, the one classroom was the nursery. I moved it later, so we couldn't use that room, and the other one was where the teens went. And then we just had this big fellowship hall for everyone else. And not a ton of kids. It was a small church. So we did something like you're talking. We gathered together for the beginning. And then we often did the then I had teachers, and we were all in the same room. So I could have kind of almost the same activity often, but with different depths. So it wasn't too much more difficult to do in different parts of the room. And you only needed 1 teacher because we were all in the same room, so you didn't have to have 2 for every age group. So that helped. And sometimes if there were only 2 teens, then I would go get them and put them in, or sometimes we, even if it was consistent that we, like, because this went on for a year, consistent, I would have things that the teens could explore with that story too, that, we were making bracelets out of pipe cleaners. They could get the embroidery thread out and make bracelets or something,
And I think, Corinna, everybody is experiencing this constant flow and flexibility needed because the RE programs have shrunk. In the last video, I said that we've discovered that it used to be about 50% of our congregations were 150 people or less. And that has risen over COVID to 70% of our congregations are 150 people or less. And that's reflecting in the RE programs too. And so a lot of people are going to be having this idea of fewer groups. One reflection I'll give to you is that at the end of my career, I had no teachers and it was fairly large, medium congregation, and we had about 1st through 3rd and then 4th through 6th age group, something like that. Absolutely no parents were available for the 4th through 5th grade. One was the treasurer of the church. He couldn't do that. Another one was the president of the church. Another one was a staff person. There just was nobody who could come and teach RE. Well, I asked the treasurer if I could come back and get an increased budget to pay for a teacher. And they said, no, not this year. We've already set our budget. That was set back in April. It's September, October. You got to figure it out. So I ended up being the teacher with the team, sort of like you did, Jenny. And I said, this is sort of a waste of your time or your money because you're paying me as a director, not as a teacher. Well, that January, when the fundraising program started again, the treasurer came back to me and said, if you could do anything you want, what would you do? And I said, I would like to have paid teachers. And they said, write us a proposal. And so I did. That started what became the School of the Spirit. And not everyone can have paid teachers, but I collected data from Lexington, Mass, and some other places that had implemented a structure of paid teachers. And I realized that when they were paying me and I had an assistant, and we oftentimes were substituting for volunteer teachers, instead of directing a program, that we might as well make that assistant a paid teacher. And we made a one-room centered start. We all had chapel in a circle, and I would lead it. And then the staff would go off and offer these center activities based on what was in the chapel. So it would be, for Soul Matters, it would be, I do the Wonder Box and maybe the story. And then there's all these other ways of exploring that story. And it became overwhelmingly popular. It was amazing. Now, one of the anecdotes I remember from Lexington is that the DRE told me she had a mother who was a lawyer come in and say, here's an extra, and I don't remember how much it was. It was pretty significant. So that you never have to ask me to be a teacher again because you have paid teachers. Just something to think about. Anyway, it wasn't a tremendously huge change in our budget. I just shifted some things around. It was so popular that the preschool teacher, who I sort of had assumed wouldn't be part of this whole process, she said, I want to do it too. I want to do it too. And she took the theme of the chapel, and we brought the preschoolers in for that part. And then they would go back to the preschool and do their own little interpretation of the story and the theme. I just say that because I want people to think out of the box as it's time to be flexible and do these, as soon as you decide that there's a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old class, then all of a sudden it shrinks and it's a different whole preschool. And the administrator part of us, all directors of religious education, want it to be something we can march through year to year. Oh yeah, then, and it just isn't, is it? It's like, okay, who's going to show up and how do we serve them? And Jenny, I love that you talked about the different depths of what we can offer. So.
Well, because I think
yes,
the one thing that I try and explain to the teachers and the parents is the kids aren't going to, the activity we do is to help them remember the story. I mean, it seems like a simple idea, but I'm not always sure that because they're not going to remember the story necessarily, or the lesson of the story for its inherentness. But the, the same reason we do rainbow promises and things, but they are going to, they might remember a couple of the activities they've done throughout the year, and somewhere in there is a thing, and that's why we do stuff over and over every year too. But and kids might when they have a sibling come home too, depending on how you do your programming. When we used to do consistent curriculum mapping and go through, oh yeah, I remember when I did that, because they see their little sibling with it. We don't do that now, but yeah. I've had a lifetime, I've probably told Katie this, but a person who is a lifetime UU minister now, and spoke in the pulpit of my home congregation and said, I remember, what I remember is all the boxes that we put together for the time machine to learn about the UU history, and when we were in 4th or 5th grade, and they're a minister now, so they know all those historical figures probably, and but they remember that experience of building that time machine to go back in history and creating those relationships and connections, and having that memory of being a child in their program. So that's a tried and true one, that time machine.
It is. So there isn't any one answer we can give you about dealing with all these shrinking programming problems, but I think your instinct is right, that having different centers that reduce the number of volunteers, that you can then offer some kind of central core message lesson of the Sunday morning time together, and then they can go to do these centers in different depths, as Jenny said. I think your instinct is right. So now we can go into opportunities. So what does the opportunity of welcome offer us for the RE year? It's going to start here pretty soon. Some people are going to start in just a week or two, because school starts like around here in Colorado, that starts, what is it now? It's the 9th, and school starts on the 13th, 14th, or 15th, something like that. So I know some people blend September as end of August, September. But the theme of welcome for September.
I'm looking forward to implementing these, but ours is still kind of the traditional church, where we won't be beginning our RE programming until after the in-gathering service.
Yeah, I think that's so smart. Let the families get their school systems set up, and yeah, that's very smart. And in a way, I know some congregations tell me that they don't start till mid-September, because they do Labor Day, and it's sort of a mushy Sunday. Yeah, it looks like Jenny. Yeah. And I use the word soft start a lot too, because for 3 years now, we don't know what's going to happen until people come in. And so you plan a little bit, and you soft start it, just like a store, have a soft opening before they have their grand opening. So they know what their families are going to want, how we can serve them.
I think there's some advantages to that, quite a few advantages, because we could also talk about covenant with the kids. We could spend one Sunday talking about what our programming is going to be looking like, and getting feedback from the kids about different activities that they most enjoy. And then by doing that, it gives us as religious educators a chance to recruit and train our teachers, because so many people disappear over July and August. So once people start coming back, you can have those conversations with more people.
Yes, Jenny?
Oh, I was thinking about this before I came. I was out walking. I said, she's going to ask for opportunities.
You know me.
And I was like trying to shift my mindset. So, to opportunities. And I started thinking, why is this so hard? Because usually I just, I mean, I have personal reasons. I've been ill this summer, but so there's that. But setting that aside, I set that aside. I said, why is it so hard to feel enthusiastic? And I've said before, I always like August when my program is so pretty in this little ball I can hold before anyone else gets a hold of it. And, and it's enjoyable. And I look at it from all the sides and it's like, oh, isn't that pretty? And, anyways, so, and I said to myself, I said, and I tried to feel that way last year, the 2 years before that, it was like, this is really depressing. But, I think it's the trauma. I honestly think I'm having trouble feeling that the world of opportunities in front of me. It feels it's the trauma, and I know this will be different and better, and I have to get over that. So I guess the opportunity is for me to experience and understand that this is traumatic, and yet there are still opportunities if I keep looking. So. And I think recognizing that I'm not the only person who feels that way. That opportunity to understand that, and maybe as we go with welcome, that that overly enthusiastic, how you doing, backslapping welcome still isn't quite what people are ready for yet. And that maybe, we all need to still, it's a we reach out to people in a different way, I think, these days, most of us, so many of us.
Mhm. Mhm.
Maybe that's our opportunity.
There you go.
Another opportunity might be as simple as food. I say that because last Sunday, I personally led the program with stepping stones. So our kids made these beautiful stepping stones, and it went very well. But in that process, we were waiting for everybody to have their chance. So then I gathered our kiddos together and I talked to them about our future program and what it's going to look like. And I'm going to have these centers set up. And, we talked about their center experience from when they were in first and second grade. And so lots came out of it. And of course, they had their own ideas of what we could do. But one of them, of course, was tied around food. But not only food for themselves, but food for their dogs. We can make food for our dogs. And it's like, oh, this is like great. I was so touched that they weren't just thinking of themselves, but they were also thinking outwardly to the larger world. Anyway, yeah. So sometimes, like I said, just talking to our kids. There were two other helpers that were with me that day, and their mouths were dropping open because our kids had fabulous ideas. And I think that by asking the kids what they're interested in, then that gives them a bit of ownership in our program. And so, yes, they did suggest some fun, creative food ideas for themselves. And one of them was even this idea about making a food item that's also a toy. And I was not clear about that. So then I said, tell me more about this. And they went on and explained what they were talking about. So, yeah, I think what I'm going to do is, follow the Soul Matters packets, but, what kind of food items might relate to that? Or what kind of, how might this food be about justice? And I think it should be pretty easy to find.
Oh, that's a
That's great.
great idea. I have two thoughts about that too. This was a different year, but it was fourth and fifth. They would seem to be the reluctant ones. And the teacher said, these kids just hate being with us, Katie. They just hate it. Their parents are dragging them to church and they don't want to be here. I said, okay, let's throw out the content, all this stuff. I think it was God images way, way back. And ask them, what would they want to have when they come to church? And they sort of slyly said food. But, long story, the teacher started doing, okay, next Sunday we're going to have make your own tacos. And they all came. And then they had another thing, and then they had another thing. It was all food related. And of course, as DREs, we know that was bonding them. And once they were bonded, then they were more than willing to talk about some bigger issues in their life and the whole program. But it took about 3 months of food. So that was a reaction I had there. The other is the reason I started School of the Spirit the way I did is that in the book, Yesterday's Children and Today's Heritage, or is it Yesterday's Heritage and Today's Children by Sophie Foz, written in 1954. Whoa, talk about heritage. I have this story in the heritage packet we just released, or probably coming out in a few days. There's a story of how they taught Sunday school based on what the children wanted. And Sophie Foz said in that book, why do we have professional ministers for the adults and not professional teachers for the children? So that you can bring this depth in and you can walk in and say, what do you want out of this religious community to children? Well, they taught them this way. What do you want to do? And the kids said, well, and these were, 50s kids. So they're not quite all over the world as our kids are. They said, well, we want to know what scientists think about God. And the teacher said, oh, well, how will we do that? And the kids came up with writing the scientists that they knew. So they wrote Dr. Albert Einstein. They wrote Oppenheimer of movie fame. They wrote several other famous people. And Dr. Einstein answered. So did some of the other scientists. I mean, this is creating curriculum from what the children are thinking about in that instance. Time consuming, but if you have paid teachers, you can do this. And Dr. Einstein wrote them back in German. So they got this letter, they had to translate it, take it out and find somebody to translate it. And then his answer was so beautiful. It was all about wonder and mystery and how he saw the word God. So once again, if we just find out what the children are interested in, that's the old-fashioned way of teaching. Yeah. They have a letter from Dr. Albert Einstein, which I thought was pretty cool. Food and Einstein, there you go. Two little stories. Well, the third part, and if we're done with opportunities and challenges that I ask on these leader labs, is takeaways. Because we might riff on each other and find some ways of thinking about this September welcome that's coming up.
I'm looking forward to making the welcoming bags with our kids. With this particular group that I have, I just think that they'll have the depth to understand how this is going to affect the congregation when they see other families coming in and taking one of the bags along with them in the future.
Mhm,
So I'm looking forward to that unfolding.
mhm. And I'm glad you said depth, because all of a sudden what they're doing is welcoming the new families in.
Right.
Beautiful thing that is.
And then I hope that they'll have the courage to go up, or I can say, I just see some connections being made with our teachers and the families as they interact.
Mhm, mhm. Yep.
I think one of the things that got me thinking when you talked about making dog food and or food for the dogs, and we did something like that last summer in August. Made dog biscuits and sweet potato jerky and cat blankets and things for the shelter. Over a couple Sundays in August. But we talked about it last year, is that we want to be more intentional with our faith and action projects for the younger children. And in the past, in another place in time, they were small because they were small children, but we had one at the end of every unit for what, I can't even remember the curriculum anymore that we were using. But I was thinking that, remembering that I want to maybe do 3 just quarterly, because before you know it, December's always here before you know it, and then May is always here before you know it, and once a month is a lot. So, but you reminded me that was something that we talked about last year, that we wanted to be more intentional about doing, as well as that intention is then bringing in other groups or other adults to help share what that opportunity might look like or might be once we identify it. So and I think the adults are a little more ready for it now. They were still getting their feet under them last year, and I'm hoping they're a little more ready for it this year. So yeah.
And the thing I learned in my religious education years was when I came up with faith and action things, to make sure I made space for the social action committee to lead it, so that we didn't get siloed, that RE had its own social action and music and
Exactly.
yeah, and approaching them and saying this would be a wonderful thing for our families and children, instead of me offering it. I learned it the hard way. I was so siloed. Oh yeah, then we do this and this and this. Yeah. What I'm
It's
gonna
hard. Sometimes that's the only way it gets done.
exactly.
It is better to do it. It's always better to include, but sometimes that doesn't make
Yes.
sense.
And we
And I think,
very
quite honestly, I think one of the problems with that is to be intentional and community building and making those connections takes time.
Mhm.
And as we all know, the majority of religious educators in our denomination don't have a ton of time to devote to their work. And as we all know, it's often easier to do it yourself. In the long run, it might be easier to let others help you, but in the short run, and sometimes that's just what we're doing, right? It's a lesson to be learned. Like you said, you've learned it yourself. And every year I try a little bit more, like a little bit more. That that is a great idea. Let me know when you're ready to get, maybe we could do that next year. I'll reach out to you next summer.
Exactly. Yes, we are. We always learn, don't we? Well, I'm going to end a little bit early so that I can take a break before we start the next one. I hope you will stay on as long as you wish to talk about Article 2. Thanks for our listening audience, and I'm going to stop this recording.